Hey YouTube, it's Brian here. I'm going to be doing part 5 of my top 100 favorite musicians of all time countdown. And we're going to start in at number 47 on this list, who's going to be Patsy Cline, one of the best female singers in all of country. I think that she broke a lot of gender barriers by being the first woman who was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. And certainly she had a rich and vibrant tone of voice that um, I don't think has really been replicated since then in the genre, which has become more of a lyrically driven genre, it seems like. When you think of the good country music that's being produced today, you think of, I think, things like Sturgill Simpson and like Hayes Carll and the Devil Makes Three. Um, but none of those people are really, like vocal virtuosos, in the same sense that Patsy Cline kind of is. So really, she kind of left something in music. She left a hole that hasn't quite been filled since her untimely death, and I think that shows how unique she was. Number 48 on here is going to be Crosby, Stills, Nash, and sometimes Young. Uh, they were sometimes joined by Neil Young, uh, they being Graham Nash, David Crosby, and Stephen Stills. But they also produced good work on their own, such as Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, or Helplessly Hoping, or Guinevere, or Triad. They had a lot of good music on their own too. They That's not to belittle the music they did with Neil Young, but it's more to say that those three deserve their props too on their own. Um, that they weren't just leaning on his talent to produce fame and good music. That they were deserving of their own credit too. Number 49 on here is going to be B.B. King, a man with a truly unique vibrato. It's almost like he came from another instrument. It came from outer space. Sorry, that was weird. I won't do that again. Um, anyways, yeah, B.B. King's vibrato, it almost is like it came from outer space because I've never heard anyone else who plays guitar make that sound quite. It's almost like he came from another instrument, or he somehow had like two lives or two spirits trapped in the center of his guitar that he was slowly letting out through his playing. And the rest of us were condemned to only have like one. I think that number 50 on this list is going to be Whitney Houston. Um, when you talk about having range vocally, didn't she even go into the whistle register? I think she did. Correct me if I'm wrong. But talk about having superior vocal range. She was up there with like a young Ella Fitzgerald and beyond. Um, Whitney Houston was one of the best technical singers, I think, in all of pop music history. So we're going to get on to number 51. You've made it this far. We're halfway through the list. Thanks for keeping on. Keeping on. Number 51 on this list is going to be Deep Purple, one of the quintessential heavy 70s rock bands, up there with people like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. I think my favorite song by them would have to be Lazy. And I think that I have some sentimental attachment to Deep Purple a little bit because they were the first song that I ever learned on guitar. I learned Smoke on the Water. And so I think I'll always be thankful to them for giving me that starting place. Number 52 on this list is going to be Kansas. And when I think of Kansas, I'm always reminded of my memories of driving around with my dad and thinking of the classic rock that was playing, Dust in the Wind, Smoke on the Water, some sort of Steve Miller song or George Thorogood song. Yeah, it was always 98.5 KFOX was the station I listened to. But yeah, I always heard a lot of Kansas growing up. Um, Not a huge diversity of songs, but I heard a lot of them. And Kansas was actually one of the first bands that I learned to finger pick a song from when I learned to play um, Dust in the Wind. I almost said when I learned to play Smoke on the Wind. Oh, wouldn't be right. Number 53 on this list would be Creedence Clearwater Revival, who were fronted by John Fogerty. And this band was strange in a way because they sounded like a southern rock band, but they were actually from like or northern California, like Berkeley or something. Um, I think it's interesting how they were able to replicate the vocals, let alone the instruments. I can understand more them getting the rhythm guitar and drums right, but for John Fogerty to actually sound like he's from the deep south, it made it a lot more authentic. And I think they've stayed relevant over the years. Like you can hear them in the soundtrack to like Forrest Gump, for example. Uh, that's one of the most prominent examples of Creedence Clearwater, aside from radio, that I've encountered. Number 54 would be the Rolling Stones. I think that they embodied that kind of rebel attitude of the 1960s rock scene, maybe a little bit more than kind of family friendly bands such as the Beatles and the Beach Boys, where everyone had like a fruit bowl and was smiling. I think that the fact that those guys were just all rowdy and they had crazy concerts, and well, I mean, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards are certainly known throughout the rock scene for being loony party boys in a way. So I think they embodied their era a lot. Some of my favorite songs by the Rolling Stones would be Painted Black and would have to be Dead Flowers, I think. Partially because of Townes Van Zandt's cover of it. Number 55 on this list is going to be Led Zeppelin. And Led Zeppelin, I think Led Zeppelin is probably the quintessential 70s rock band. I know that we just used that term. But it kind of comes up here again, in terms of being, they're one of the best selling bands of all time. They get some of the most airplay. I actually got thrown out of a guitar store one time for playing the intro to Stairway to Heaven. Um, yeah, that was kind of, or they asked me to stop playing it, and I think if I hadn't, they would have thrown me out. Um, yeah, let's get on with the list. Led Zeppelin. I don't really need to tell you guys about Led Zeppelin. Number 56 is the Carter family. The Carter family are one of the most significant early influences in country music. Johnny Cash actually married into the Carter family with June Carter Cash, I think. Um, so let's get on to number 57. And that would be Willie Nelson, a former member of the Highwaymen and a legendary figure in 420 culture. But I think that Willie Nelson's kind of soothing, almost like hot cocoa kind of voice, um, I think that it kind of makes it almost relaxing in a way that most country music is kind of depressing and is kind of a downer and doesn't really pick your mood up. I think Willie Nelson is kind of like the equivalent of like sitting around a Christmas tree or something. Number 58 on my list is actually going to be Green Day. alternative rock legends and pioneers, you know. Probably my favorite song to play on all of guitar is Time of Your Life, you know. But I also like Basket Case a lot. That's a great song. Green Day, I think they've gone downhill a little bit in the 2000s since they've started doing kind of more like emo pop music and stuff. But at the same time, it doesn't really undo what they had done before and the legacy they left behind as one of the great alternative rock bands. Number 59 on my list is going to be the 13th Floor Elevators, a psychedelic rock band from the 1960s, fronted by Rocky Erickson. And they only had a couple of albums, kind of like the Sonics or Linda Perhacs, or you know. But at the same time, everything that they left behind was pretty awesome, you know. I like that their cover of that Bob Dylan song, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. God, I hope I'm not botching the title of that. Anyways, yeah, you should totally check them out. I don't know if Rocky Erickson is still around. He, unfortunately, I think, had like shock therapy, like insulin shock therapy, back when they were still doing that. I think another person who had that was Townes Van Zandt. But Rocky Erickson, he lived through it, but at the same time, he was kind of noticeably not the same, you know? Okay, let's get on to number 60, the Sonics. And they're still good today, you know? I saw them performing as like old guys who looked like Jerry Springer, and they were still awesome, you know? It's like one of them looked like my uncle, the other one looked like Jerry Springer, and it's like, you know, it's like these are guys who had looked like cool, like, you know, like wearing their leather jackets and shit back in the 60s when they were, I don't know if they were really popular. The Sonics are kind of a cult band, you know? But they're really surprisingly heavy for the time, you know, which is the early to mid 60s. I think that the Sonics, they're really surprisingly heavy in songs like Strychnine and Walking the Dog and Louie Louie. I know that's a cover, but still, they really turn up the volume loud, and they sound like an 80s band in a sense. They sound like one of those punk rock bands who would have come about 20 years later. They sound kind of like somewhere between like the Beatles and the Sex Pistols, which is a really weird combo. But kind of imagine that more mellow 60s rock, but fused with some of the aggression and volume of a band that would come several decades later. Um, I don't know if the Sonics were quite famous enough to have been a huge inspiration to a lot of people, but they certainly were a predecessor to them if they didn't directly inspire them at their roots, then they were certainly a predecessor. Okay, so let's get on probably to the last person that we'll cover today, and that's Van Morrison. Van Morrison, you know, singer songwriter type. I really, really love his songwriting. I own his best of CD. I think that Van Morrison, I kind of think of guys like Jackson Browne or James Taylor, you know. But Van Morrison is certainly deserving of his own spot on here. Anyways, thank you for watching.